There are moments in geopolitics when the carefully constructed architecture of an entire strategic framework begins to fracture, not gradually, not quietly, but in full view of the world in real time, with consequences that ripple outward far beyond the geography where the decisions are being made. This is one of those moments, and what makes it uniquely dangerous is not any single event, not any single strike, any single ultimatum, or any single warning delivered behind closed doors in Washington. What makes it dangerous is that all of these events, the Qatar military threat, the oil executive ultimatum, the targeting decisions at Karg Island, the Hormuz closure, the price trajectory toward $200 per barrel, aren't not see separate dry infer. Stories unfolding on parallel tracks. They are the same story, one story. And the way that story connects reveals something about the direction of this conflict that no official press briefing, no White House statement, and no Pentagon spokesperson is currently communicating with the clarity that the situation demands. So let us begin at the moment that should have stopped every strategic analyst in Washington cold. The moment Qatar, the country that hosts the largest American military installation in the entire Middle East, the country that has been conducting sensitive back-channel diplomacy on Washington's behalf since the very opening days of this conflict, the country that is, by every formal definition, on the American side of this war, threatened military retaliation against Israel. Let that settle for a moment. Not Iran, not Hezbollah, not a declared adversary or a hostile non-state actor. Qatar, a Gulf state, an American partner, a nation whose soil carries tens of thousands of American troops and whose diplomatic channels have been critical instruments of American strategic communication throughout this crisis. Qatar threatened to retaliate militarily against Israel after Israeli forces struck a gas installation that Qatar partially owns, and the response from Washington was a public statement from President Donald Trump declaring that it was the last time that Israel had misbehaved, that it would not happen again, a promise delivered publicly to reassure an ally that had just issued a military ultimatum against another ally. This is the headline, this is the story, and understanding why this moment is as significant as it is requires assembling every piece of context that the official framing consistently leaves out. The conflict that produced this rupture between two American partners began 21 days ago. What was described in its early hours as a decisive, time-limited military operation, an effort to fundamentally alter the strategic equation in the Persian Gulf through targeted force, has instead produced an escalation sequence that defense analysts recognize with uncomfortable familiarity. 50,000 United States Marines are currently deployed in the Gulf theater. An additional 2,500 personnel are being redeployed from the Indo-Pacific to join them. The Hormuz Strait, through which approximately 20% of globally traded oil passes every single day, has been closed. The South Fars gas field, one of the largest natural gas installations on Earth, has sustained damage. The Ras Laffan industrial complex in Qatar, a facility of enormous strategic and economic significance, experienced a fire following an Israeli strike. Saudi Arabian refinery infrastructure has been struck by drone attacks. The Fujairah terminal, a critical node in global oil logistics, has sustained damage from additional drone strikes, and oil prices are moving toward levels that the United States Secretary of Energy has publicly acknowledged may reach $200 per barrel, a price point not seen in 4 decades. This is the operational environment inside which Qatar issued its ultimatum. And this is the operational environment inside which Iran has been conducting a steady, methodical campaign of diplomatic messaging to every Gulf state in the region, a campaign that began on February 28th and has continued without interruption through every escalation that has followed. The message Iran has been delivering is simple, consistent, and, as events have now demonstrated, increasingly credible. The protection Washington promised did not protect Ras Laffan. It did not protect the Saudi refinery. It did not prevent an Israeli strike on Qatari-owned infrastructure. And it will not protect whatever comes next. The choice facing every Gulf state that hosts American forces, conducts American diplomacy, and relies on American security guarantees is now being posed in explicit terms. Continue hosting the forces that make you a target, or find an accommodation with Tehran that removes the targeting rationale entirely. Iran has understood something from the very beginning of this conflict that the American strategic framework has struggled to accommodate. The contradiction at the center of American decision-making is not hidden. It is structural, it is visible, and it is being exploited with precision. The country conducting this military operation on America's behalf, Israel, is simultaneously pushing America's most critical Gulf partners toward the country America is fighting against. Every time Israel strikes infrastructure with Gulf state ownership, every time Washington issues a reassurance that the targeted ally finds insufficient, and every time Iran's prediction that American protection is unreliable proves accurate, Iran's strategic position strengthens without Iran firing a single shot at an American target. To understand the full depth of what is unfolding, it is essential to examine a meeting that took place inside the White House between senior executives from ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Phillips 66, and senior officials of the Trump administration. This meeting has received less analytical attention than it deserves because the nature of the message delivered inside that room is not the kind of message that fits comfortably into the standard framework of how the energy industry relates to government. These are not companies whose executives travel to Washington to complain that profits are too low. These are not lobbyists seeking regulatory relief or tax concessions. These are the chief decision-makers of the most powerful fossil fuel enterprises on Earth, companies that, by simple economic logic, should benefit from rising oil prices because rising prices mean rising revenue. And they went to the White House not to celebrate the price increases their quarterly earnings would theoretically reflect, but to deliver a warning. The warning was this: the worst of the energy disruption has not yet arrived. The Hormuz closure, affecting 20% of globally traded oil, will continue generating chaos in supply chains around the world. Prices will continue rising, and the escalation trajectory currently in place is approaching a threshold, not the threshold of profitable disruption, but the threshold of structural economic damage. That distinction is the analytically critical element of the warning, and it is one that requires explanation, because it is not intuitive to anyone outside the energy economics profession. Oil companies profit from price increases up to a specific point. Below that point, higher prices mean higher revenue, better margins, stronger earnings, and satisfied shareholders. Above that point, however, something different begins to happen. Prices become high enough not merely to extract more revenue from existing consumer demand, but to permanently alter the consumer behavior that creates that demand in the first place. Above that threshold, sustained high prices accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. They destroy the discretionary consumer spending that keeps the broader economy functioning. They generate inflationary pressures that produce political responses, regulatory crackdowns, windfall profit taxes, accelerated investment in alternative energy infrastructure that damage the long-term structural position of the fossil fuel industry far more severely than any short-term market disruption. The executives delivering this warning to the Trump administration were not speaking as short-term traders anxious about a bad quarter. They were speaking as long-term strategists who understand that the price trajectory this conflict is producing leads toward a destination that permanently erodes the foundation of the economic model their companies depend on. The American Secretary of Energy's public acknowledgement that oil reaching $200 per barrel is not ruled out is the governmental confirmation of what the industry executives communicated privately. At $200 per barrel, retail gasoline prices in the United States roughly double from current levels. The cascading effect through every supply chain on Earth, because every supply chain on Earth touches energy in some form, produces food price increases, transportation cost increases, manufacturing cost increases, and the kind of persistent structural inflation that has already demonstrated its capacity to destroy political administrations. The inflation that contributed to the electoral outcome that brought the current administration to power was generated by far more modest supply disruptions than what the current conflict is producing. What is approaching now is categorically different in scale. The Kharg Island targeting decision illuminates the contradiction at the heart of American strategic decision-making with a precision that deserves careful examination. Kharg Island is Iran's primary oil export terminal. It is the facility through which the overwhelming majority of Iranian crude oil reaches global markets. When President Trump announced that American forces had struck the island, the analytical question that immediately followed was not whether the strike occurred, but what specifically was struck. The answer reveals everything. Military installations on the island were hit. The oil export infrastructure, the terminals, the loading facilities, the pipeline infrastructure through which Iranian crude flows to tankers was left intact. That was not an accident. It was not an oversight. It was a deliberate targeting decision made by military planners who understand the energy economics that the White House oil executives tried to communicate, and made by policymakers who understand that destroying Iran's oil export capacity simultaneously with every other supply disruption currently in progress, the Hormuz closure, the South Pars damage, the Ras Laffan fire, the Saudi refinery strikes, would produce oil price movements that cross the threshold the industry executives identified as structurally catastrophic. Iran's strategic planners built their entire response architecture around this constraint. They understood from before the first strike that the United States could not fully prosecute the energy dimension of this conflict without destroying the global economy that American power projection depends on. And so they positioned their most critical economic infrastructure, the oil export capacity that funds their military operations and sustains their government, at exactly the intersection of military significance and economic consequence that American targeting doctrine cannot comfortably strike. Every time American and Israeli forces strike military targets while leaving Iranian energy infrastructure intact, two messages are sent simultaneously. The first is delivered to Iran. Your operational capacity to sustain this conflict is preserved. The second is delivered to the global market. The United States cannot fully neutralize the energy dimension of this war without triggering the economic consequences it is trying to avoid. Iran's oil weapon, as a result, gains relative strength with each passing day. Not because Iran is winning military engagements, but because the constraints on American action are making that weapon more effective than Iran's own military capabilities could make it. The escalation pattern this conflict has entered is one that military historians and defense theorists have documented across decades of American military engagements with a consistency that should by now produce immediate recognition in anyone responsible for strategic decision-making. The logic begins with a decision to change a bad strategic situation through a decisive military action. A target is selected, a strike is executed. The calculation is that the strike will alter the adversary's decision-making calculus sufficiently to produce the political outcome that justifies the military action. The adversary does not capitulate. The analysis concludes that the strike was insufficient, that a larger strike, a more consequential target, a more significant demonstration of American military capability will produce the result that the previous strike did not. The larger strike does not produce capitulation either. The adversary adapts. It hardens its resistance. It disperses its assets. It presents a new set of circumstances that require yet another strike, larger and more consequential than the last. This is the precise pattern that escalated a limited American advisory presence in Vietnam into 500,000 military personnel, and a conflict that lasted a decade beyond any rational strategic justification. It is the pattern that produced an Iraq commitment that stretched across 2 decades, cost trillions of dollars, and ended with outcomes that bore no resemblance to the objectives that justified the initial invasion. The political scientist Robert Pape has analyzed this escalation mechanism with particular precision. When a bad strategic status quo is challenged with decisive military action and the adversary responds by changing tactics rather than capitulating, the internal logic of the original decision demands escalation. Each escalation step is justified by the failure of the previous one. The exit from this cycle requires either achieving the original objective, which 21 days of operational history suggests is not imminent, or accepting the political cost of acknowledging publicly that the objective is not achievable through the means being applied. Neither option is currently visible in the administration's public positioning. What is visible instead is the deployment of additional forces to supplement those whose previous application did not produce the declared result. 50,000 Marines in the Gulf, 2,500 more arriving from the Indo-Pacific. Not because the strategic situation has improved, because the escalation logic requires more force to produce the effect that previous applications of force did not produce. That is the definition of the escalation trap, and recognizing the trap does not by itself provide the exit. But it does explain why the exit is not appearing in any official communication about the strategic direction of this conflict. The global dimension of this crisis is one that political framing consistently underestimates, and it requires direct attention. The disruption occurring in the Persian Gulf is not a regional problem. It is not a Middle Eastern problem. It is a problem for every economy on Earth that has built its functioning on the assumption that the physical infrastructure of global oil supply is stable and protected from exactly the kind of simultaneous multi-node disruption that is now occurring. Canada produces oil, Mexico produces oil, Norway produces oil, the United States produces oil. None of these facts protect the consumers in those countries from paying the global market price for energy, because the global market price is determined not by what any individual country produces, but by the aggregate supply and demand balance across the entire system. A closed Hormuz Strait does not affect Canadian oil production. It affects the global price signal at which that production is valued. And it is the global price signal, not the domestic production volume, that determines what a consumer in Toronto or Mexico City or Vancouver pays at the pump or for home heating. The political narrative of energy independence, which every Western government has been marketing to its population for the better part of 2 decades, is a genuine description of production self-sufficiency and a complete misrepresentation of price sovereignty. A country can produce every barrel of oil it consumes domestically and still pay the global market price for that oil, because the companies extracting that oil operate in a global market where selling below the global price is economically irrational. The Hormuz closure does not care about American shale production volumes or Canadian oil sands capacity. It cares about the global balance of supply and demand, and it is moving that balance in one direction, with consequences that arrive in household budgets around the world, regardless of geographic distance from the Persian Gulf. This brings the analysis back to the behavioral threshold that the oil industry executives identified as the genuine danger point. When retail gasoline prices in the United States reach approximately $7 per gallon, the level consistent with oil at $200 per barrel, the economic calculation for a significant portion of the American consumer market changes in a way that does not reverse when oil prices eventually decline. The decision is no longer whether to absorb a temporary fuel cost increase. It becomes whether to eliminate fuel costs entirely by transitioning to an electric vehicle. That is a structural purchasing decision, an infrastructure investment, and a consumption pattern change. Once it occurs at sufficient scale, the market dynamic that produced it no longer needs to persist for the change to be permanent. The transition, once made, tends to stay made. The Chinese electric vehicle market has produced vehicles that are technologically competitive with American and European alternatives at price points that would be genuinely attractive to American consumers if the tariff barriers preventing their import were not in place. Canada has recently negotiated trade arrangements with China that reduce tariff friction on Chinese electric vehicles. The irony embedded in the situation the oil industry executives were implicitly acknowledging in the White House meeting is worth stating directly. The conflict that is generating the price spike pushing consumers toward electric vehicles is simultaneously accelerating the obsolescence of the fossil fuel economic model that American strategic interests in the Persian Gulf were historically designed to preserve. The war for oil, conducted at the intensity and with the disruption that the current conflict is producing, is making oil less relevant in the most important consumer economies for the long-term global demand picture. And the companies whose executives travel to the White House understand this dynamic better than any government agency currently advising the administration, which is precisely why their message was not a complaint about a difficult quarter. It was a warning about permanent structural consequences. The international dimensions of the Qatar rupture extend beyond the immediate diplomatic crisis between two American partners. Iran's messaging campaign to Gulf states, begun on February 28th and sustained through every subsequent escalation, has been building toward exactly this moment. Tehran has been patient, methodical, and consistent. Every time American protection proved insufficient to prevent a strike on Gulf infrastructure, Iran's case became stronger. Every time Washington's public reassurances failed to prevent the next escalation, Iran's argument that accommodation with Tehran offers more reliable security than dependence on Washington became more credible to the governments receiving it. Qatar's military ultimatum is the most visible indicator yet that this campaign is producing results. And the Trump administration's response, a public promise to control an ally that has demonstrated on the most consequential military decisions of this entire conflict that it does not request Washington's permission before acting, does not resolve the underlying dynamic, it defers it. Political analysts observing this situation have noted that the administration's public framing of strategic progress does not map onto the operational realities accumulating in the conflict record. The declared objectives of the operation that began 21 days ago have not been achieved. The escalation pattern in place is consuming additional force commitments without producing the political outcomes that those commitments were intended to generate. The energy disruption is approaching price levels that the most sophisticated industry voices in the American economy have identified as structurally dangerous, and the diplomatic architecture that American strategy in the Gulf depends on, the network of partner relationships, host nation agreements, and back-channel communications channels, is showing stress fractures that a single public promise cannot repair. The financial dimensions of this crisis deserve explicit attention because they connect the energy disruption to a broader set of economic consequences that have not yet fully materialized, but are moving in a direction that several indicators are already tracking. Dubai real estate values have fallen 30%. That is not a minor market fluctuation. Dubai real estate is, among other things, a store of value for Gulf sovereign wealth funds, funds whose investment portfolios are deeply integrated into American and European financial markets. Gulf sovereign wealth funds hold significant positions in American equities, American real estate, American financial instruments, and American infrastructure. If the risk reassessment currently underway in the Gulf produces capital withdrawal from those positions at any significant scale, the consequences for American financial markets would arrive at a moment when those markets are already absorbing the economic effects of energy price disruption, inflationary pressure, and supply chain dysfunction. Goldman Sachs modeled a global recession scenario as a tail risk in its analysis of this conflict's economic trajectory. The distance between tail risk and baseline scenario is shrinking in proportion to the duration and intensity of the disruption. The upcoming analytical inflection points that this situation will produce are now reasonably foreseeable in their categories, if not their precise timing. The Qatar military ultimatum has not yet produced a formal diplomatic consequence that changes the operational geometry of the American base network in the Gulf. When it does, whether through a renegotiation of basing arrangements, a modification of Qatar's diplomatic posture, or a more formal statement of conditions, that development will represent a structural change in American strategic architecture in the region rather than a temporary political friction point. The oil price threshold that the industry executives identified as the structural danger point has not yet been crossed. When prices approach or reach $200 per barrel, which the Secretary of Energy has declined to rule out, the behavioral consequences that the industry warned about will begin to manifest in consumer purchasing decisions and political responses that will generate their own momentum. The escalation trap will produce its next iteration. The additional 2,500 personnel being deployed from the Indo-Pacific to join the 50,000 already in the Gulf theater represent a force commitment increase justified by the failure of previous force applications to achieve declared objectives. When that additional force commitment also fails to produce the outcomes it was deployed to generate, the escalation logic will demand another commitment. The pattern is as predictable as it is difficult to interrupt from inside the decision-making architecture that produced it, and the official framing of strategic progress will continue to diverge from the operational record in ways that the evidence will eventually make impossible to sustain. What the assembled picture of this moment communicates, from Qatar's unprecedented military ultimatum against an American ally, to the oil executive warning delivered in the heart of the American executive branch, to the deliberate targeting constraint at Karg Island, to the escalation trap mechanics that 50,000 deployed Marines and 21 days of operational history are beginning to replicate, to the price trajectory toward levels not seen in 4 decades, is that the strategic architecture of this conflict has entered a phase where the contradictions at its center can no longer be managed through public statements, partner reassurances, or incremental force additions. The country conducting this operation on America's behalf is pushing America's most critical Gulf partners toward the adversary America is fighting. The energy disruption the operation is generating is approaching the threshold that the most sophisticated economic actors in the American system have identified as structurally damaging to the economy that American power projection depends on. The targeting constraints that American decision-makers are observing to prevent that economic damage are simultaneously preserving Iran's operational capacity and demonstrating the limits of American willingness to fully prosecute the energy dimension of this war. And the war itself, the one that was described in its opening hours as decisive, time-limited, and strategically transformative, is on its 21st day, with its declared objectives unachieved, its force commitments expanding, and the very companies that profit from fossil fuels telling the administration that the situation is getting out of hand. The arc of this story is not finished. The Qatar diplomatic consequence is still materializing. The oil price is still rising. The escalation trap is still turning. The Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund reassessment is still in progress. The behavioral threshold that permanently alters the relationship between American consumers and fossil fuels is still approaching. Each of these developments will produce its own moment of analytical clarity, a moment when the evidence assembles into a picture that the official framing cannot contain. When those moments arrive, the analysis will be here. Evidence first, what it means for you, always.